This training video includes information related to the 2023-2024 ESSA program monitoring random validation process administered in the Federal Program Compliance Division at the Texas Education Agency. The information shared in this video was shared with LEAs statewide in a statewide virtual training that was conducted on September 26, 2023. My name is Jaime Huerta, and I am the Division Director for the Federal Program Compliance Division at the Texas Education Agency and also the State Director for the Title I Part A and Title IV Part A programs. If you have any questions during the training or after the training, please feel free to give us a call on our Division phone number at 512-463-9499 or via our Division email address at essasupport@tea.texas.gov. The Federal Program Compliance Division consists of the following team members: Didi Garcia, Lanitra Guess, Idalia Ibanez, Nes Paniagua Jimenez, Gerardo Ramirez, and Vivian Smurl. On this slide, you will find the contact information for the various programs administered in the Federal Program Compliance Division, along with the email address and phone number for each individual team member in the FPC division. The ESSA program monitoring random validation process is part of TEA's monitoring system that has been accepted by the U.S. Department of Education for the programs administered in the Federal Program Compliance Division. It consists of annual program monitoring activities where LEAs are randomly selected to participate based on the ESSA Consolidated Federal Grant application for the current year. LEAs are asked to submit documentation for review by TEA for selected program requirements for the current year. Random validation monitoring activities are conducted using a continuous improvement approach rather than punitive. The review process is conducted in real time to provide LEAs with an opportunity to correct any non-compliance issues that have been identified before the end of the grant period. Agency staff will review the documentation to determine if it is sufficient to support LEA compliance with the particular program requirement. LEAs that submit sufficient documentation to support LEA compliance will be assigned a met requirement status for the requirement, and the random validation will be considered closed. LEAs that submit insufficient documentation will be assigned an improvement needed status for the requirement. LEAs with an improvement needed status will be provided technical assistance by their Regional Education Service Center after the results are communicated with the LEA. The LEAs with an improvement needed status will also be required to resubmit documentation for the 2024-2025 school year by September 30th, 2024 to ensure the program requirements are implemented correctly. The programs that have been selected for the random validation process are programs that are administered in the Federal Program Compliance Division, which we refer to as the Big Four programs, which include Title I Part A, Title I Part C, Title II Part A, and Title IV Part A. Additionally, Title I Part A supplement not supplant methodology is also a requirement that will be monitored via the random validation process. Additionally, the EdFlex Title I Part A Campus School-Wide Program Eligibility Waiver, the Title I Part D program, the Title V Part B program, private school equitable services, and the unsafe school choice option. There are several parameters that we use in the selection of the LEAs that are going to participate in the random validation process. For the 23-24 Big Four random validations, that is for the Title I Part A, Title I Part C, Title II Part A, and Title IV Part A, we will not select from the 208 LEAs that were selected for random validation in those four programs in 22-23. For all other random validations, the 208 LEAs selected for random validation in the last school year for 22-23 could be selected for other random validations in 23-24 that do not consist of the Big Four programs. An LEA selected for the Rural Low-Income Schools Program validation, that is a Title V Part B program, may be selected for up to 2 random validations in 2023-2024. The random validation process is administered in 2 phases. For Phase 1, the programs that are validated are the Title I Part A, Title I Part C, Title II Part A, Title IV Part A, and Title I Part A supplement not supplant methodology. For the Phase 1 programs, LEAs will be notified of their selection on October 9th and will be required to submit the documentation requested by October 23rd. Phase 2 includes the unsafe school choice option, private school equitable services, Title V Part B, Title I Part D, and the EdFlex Title I school-wide eligibility waiver. For Phase 2, LEAs will be notified of their selection on November 28th, and they will be required to submit their documentation by December 12th. LEAs will be notified of their selection via an auto-generated email from the Department of Grant Compliance and Administration Work App System. The email will include the program and program requirement that the LEA was selected to participate in. The email notification will also be sent to the LEA contacts and ESC communication list for the LEA's region that are current in the Department of Grant Compliance and Administration Work App System. Additionally, this year we will also be posting on our website the LEAs that were selected for each program and each program requirement after LEAs have been notified of selection. For notification of results, LEAs will receive an auto-generated email from the Department of Grant Compliance and Administration Work App System. The email will include the program and program requirement the LEA was selected to participate and the documentation review status of either met requirement or improvement needed. The email notification will be sent to LEA contacts and ESC communication list for the LEA's region that are current in the Department of Grant Compliance Administration Work App System. Regional Education Service Centers are provided with funding to support LEAs through the ESSA Basic Services Initiatives Grant under the following programs: Title I Part A, Title I Part C, Title II Part A, and Title IV Part A. Contact your Regional Education Service Center for professional development opportunities and for technical assistance. Please note that your regional ESC program contacts will be contacting LEAs that have been selected to participate in the random validation process to offer and provide complimentary technical assistance to the LEA prior to documentation submission. This concludes the overview of the ESSA program monitoring random validation process for 23-24. If you have any questions, please email them to essasupport@tea.texas.gov. We will now take an overview of Phase 1 and Phase 2 of the random validation process. This training video will provide an overview of the Phase 1 process. For Phase 1 of the random validation process, the Federal Program Compliance Division administered programs that have been selected are the Big Four, which is Title I Part A, Title I Part C, Title II Part A, Title IV Part A, and Title I Part A Supplement Not Supplant. We will now take a look at the number of LEAs selected. For Title I Part A, 60 LEAs will be selected, 12 of which will come from 5 ESC regions. For Title I Part C, 60 LEAs will be selected, 12 will come from 5 ESC regions. Title II Part A, 60 LEAs will be selected, with 12 LEAs coming from 5 different ESC regions. And for Title IV Part A, 60 LEAs will be selected, with 12 coming from 5 ESC regions. And for Title I, Part A, Supplement Not Supplant Methodology, we will select up to 10 LEAs, and it'll be up to 1 LEA per ESC selected. We will now take a look at the number of program requirements selected by program for Phase 1 of the 21-22 random validation process. For the Big Four, Title I Part A, Title I Part C, Title II Part A, and Title IV Part A, each of the programs will have 3 requirements that have been selected. For Title I Part A, Supplement Not Supplant, there will be 1 program requirement selected. We will now take a look at the 23-24 random validation program requirements that have been selected for this random validation season. For Title I Part A, Supplement Not Supplant Methodology, the Campus Written Parent and Family Engagement Policy, the LEA Written Parent and Family Engagement Policy, and Campus Allocations. Title I Part C, Identification and Recruitment, Priority for Service, and Intrastate Coordination. For Title II Part A, the 3 program requirements selected include alignment with challenging state academic standards, meaningful consultation, and prioritization of funds. The 3 program requirements selected for Title IV Part A include consultation, evaluation of program effectiveness, and description of Title IV Part A funded programs and activities. In summary, for Title I Part A, again, there will be 60 LEAs that are selected with 1 randomly selected campus per LEA. There will be 3 requirements. 12 LEAs will be selected from 5 ESC regions, and each LEA will only be required to submit documentation for 1 selected program requirement. LEAs will be notified upon selection which program requirement they are to submit documentation for. For Title I Part C, 60 LEAs will be selected. There will be 3 requirements. 12 LEAs will be selected from 5 particular ESCs to submit documentation for 1 program requirement. Title II Part A, 60 LEAs will be selected for 3 program requirements. 12 LEAs from 5 ESCs will be selected to submit documentation for 1 program requirement. For Title IV Part A, 60 LEAs will be selected with 3 program requirements. 12 LEAs will be selected from 5 different ESCs for submission of documentation for 1 program requirement. And for Title I Part A, Supplement Not Supplant, 40 LEAs will be selected for 1 program requirement, and it'll be 2 LEAs per Education Service Center. We will now close out this portion of the training by looking at the timeline specific to Phase 1 random validation activities. Again, for the Phase 1 part of the process, we will be looking at Title I Part A, Title I Part C, Title II Part A, Title IV Part A, and Title I Part A Supplement Not Supplant Methodology. LEAs will be notified on October 9th that they have been selected for the random validation process. Between October 10th and October 23rd, the Education Service Centers will offer and provide technical assistance to the LEAs that have been selected. By October 23rd, the LEAs are required to submit their documentation via the Federal Program Compliance Division Random Validation Work App. TEA will complete their documentation review by February 5th. TEA will contact ESCs to discuss preliminary results between February 15th and March 1st. And all LEAs will be notified of their results of the Random Validation Documentation Review by March 18th via the Federal Program Compliance Division Random Validation Work App. This concludes the training for the Phase 1 overview of the Program Monitoring Random Validation process administered by the Federal Program Compliance Division. If you have any questions, please email them to essasupport@tea.texas.gov. Thank you. In this portion of the training, we will review the program monitoring random validations process for Phase 2. Phase 2 of the random validations process includes the following programs administered in the Federal Program Compliance Division: EdFlex, Title I Part A Campus School-Wide Program Eligibility Waiver; Title I Part D, Prevention and Intervention for Delinquent, Neglected, and At-Risk Youth; Title V Part B, the Rural and Low-Income Schools Program; Private School Equitable Services; and the Unsafe School Choice option. We will now take a look at the number of LEAs selected by program. For the EdFlex waiver, Title I Part A Campus School-Wide Program Eligibility, 10 to 15 LEAs will be selected. For the Title I Part D program, 20 LEAs will be selected. For the Title V Part B program, 30 LEAs will be selected. For Private School Equitable Services, 40 LEAs will be selected. And for the Unsafe School Choice option, 40 LEAs will be selected. The selection method for EdFlex, Title I Part D, and Title V Part B will be that LEAs are randomly selected from across the state regardless of ESC region. For Private School Equitable Services, we will be selecting 0 to 2 LEAs per Education Service Center region. And for Unsafe School Choice option, we will be selecting 2 LEAs per Education Service Center region. We will now take a look at the number of selected program requirements for each of the programs. For the EdFlex waiver, there's only one requirement. For Title I Part D, there will also be only one requirement. For Title V Part B, there will only be one requirement. For Private School Equitable Services, there will be 4 requirements. However, each LEA selected to participate in the Private School Equitable Services random validation will only be required to submit documentation for one of the requirements that they have been notified that they will be selected for. And for Unsafe School Choice option, there is only one requirement. We will now take a detailed look at the actual program requirements selected. For the EdFlex Title I Part A School-Wide Program Eligibility Waiver, we will be looking at the supporting documentation form. If your LEA has been selected for the Title I Part D program, you will be required to submit the formal agreement. If you were selected for Title V Part B, we will be looking at use of funds. As previously mentioned, for Private School Equitable Services, each LEA selected to participate in the random validation for this requirement will be selected to submit documentation for only one of the following 4 requirements: LEA documented equitable services administration amounts, timely and meaningful consultation, LEA documented PMP equitable services amounts, and LEA maintained inventory control of purchases for PNP equitable services. And for the Unsafe School Choice option, we will be looking at the USCO policy. Please note that this is just a very brief description of the requirements, but under the training resources, there are videos that go over the requirements, specifically the program requirements and the documentation that will be required to be submitted for each of these requirements. There's also an accompanying handbook for each of the requirements that provides additional information. So be sure to take a look at our resources to gather more information and details related to what is being requested for submission by the LEA if they're selected to participate in any of the Phase 2 programs that we are including in our random validation process. So in summary, for the EdFlex waiver requirement, we will have 10 to 15 LEAs selected with one requirement. Title I Part D, 20 LEAs selected for one requirement. Title V Part B, 30 LEAs selected for one requirement. Private School Equitable Services, or PNP, 40 LEAs selected with 4 requirements. And Unsafe School Choice option, 40 LEAs selected for 1 requirement. The selection method for EdFlex waiver, Title I Part D and Title V Part B will be that LEAs are randomly selected from across the state regardless of ESC region. For private school equitable services, we will be selecting 0 to 2 LEAs per Education Service Center region, and for unsafe school choice option, we will be selecting 2 LEAs per Education Service Center region. We will now close out this portion of the random validation training by providing the Phase 2 timeline. Again, for Phase 2, the programs being validated are Title I Part D, Private School Equitable Services, Rural Low-Income Schools Program, the Unsafe School Choice Option, and the EdFlex Title I Part A School-Wide Eligibility Waiver. On November 28th, LEAs will be notified that they have been selected. Between November 29th and December 12th, Education Service Centers will provide and offer technical assistance to the LEA selected. On December 12th, LEAs will submit their documentation via the Federal Program Compliance Division Random Validation Work App. TEA will complete their documentation review by February 5th. TEA will contact ESCs to discuss preliminary results between February 15th and March 1st. And all LEAs will be notified of their final results on March 18th via an auto-generated email from the Federal Program Compliance Division Random Validation Work App System. This concludes the overview of the random validation process for Phase 2. If you have any questions, please reach out to us via telephone, via the division phone number of 512-463-9499, or via our division email address, which is essasupport@tea.texas.gov. Thank you. In this section of the training, we will be looking at the Program Monitoring Random Validations Process handbooks. There is one handbook per program requirement that LEAs can use as they assemble their documentation in preparation for submitting it for review to the Texas Education Agency Federal Program Compliance Division. When LEAs are notified that they have been selected for random validation, there will be a link in the email to the particular handbook that pertains to the program and the program requirement that the LEA was selected to participate in. The first section of the handbook is an introduction that just provides general information related to the random validation process. The next section of the handbook includes a table that describes information related to the particular random validation requirement that was selected. The first item that's described is a general description of the statutory requirement. The second item in the table includes the statutory citation and language from the Every Student Succeeds Act statute. The third piece of information includes how the particular item is referenced in the ESSA program-specific provisions and assurances. And the last piece of information includes how the item is listed in the Compliance Report Program Compliance Self-Check. The following section of the handbook is of great importance to LEAs that are in preparation for assembling the documentation requested to be submitted. LEAs are asked to include the following selected documentation referenced in the table below in order to demonstrate compliance with the program requirement that's been described. TEA will utilize the following table to determine if the LEA submitted sufficient documentation to support LEA compliance. LEAs that submit sufficient documentation to support LEA compliance will be assigned a met requirement status for the requirement. LEAs that submit insufficient documentation will be assigned an improvement needed status for the requirement. The table below shows an example of what it will look like. Each type of selected documentation that is required will have a number as well as the name of what the documentation is that is required, as well as the description of the acceptable documentation that will provide additional details related to the documentation that's been requested. Keep in mind that documenting overall compliance for a program requirement may require several forms of documentation to be maintained locally and available upon request by TEA and/or an auditor. To ensure overall compliance with program requirements, LEAs should refer to the program guide and/or other program-related resources that reference the multiple forms of documentation required to be maintained locally. The documentation requested for this submission during the random validation process may not include all forms of documentation that are required to be maintained locally. The next sections of the handbook include instructions for assembling documentation and instructions for submitting documentation. These instructions will be reviewed thoroughly in the next section of this training. The final page of the handbook contains the Phase 1 random validation timeline. This is for the LEA's reference so that they could see all the dates that are associated with the Phase 1 random validation process. This concludes a section of the training related to the Program Monitoring Random Validations Process handbooks. If you have any questions, please email us at essasupport@tea.texas.gov. Thank you. In this section of the training, you will learn about the documentation submission instructions and requirements for the Program Monitoring Random Validations process administered by the Federal Program Compliance Division at the Texas Education Agency. Preparing documents for upload for the random validation process is a two-step process. Step 1 includes gathering and assembling the documentation into one PDF formatted file, and Step 2 includes logging into the FPC Work App system to complete the details form and upload the documentation PDF file. We will go over Steps 1 and 2 in detail on the following slides. Step 1 includes gathering and assembling the documentation. LEAs are going to want to use the requested documentation section of the handbook to gather and organize the documentation that is being requested. The LEA should assemble the documentation in the order it is requested. For example, they should place their documentation with 1.1 being addressed first, 1.2 second, and so on. The LEA should also number their pages of the documentation file consecutively. Some tips to facilitate the documentation review process include ordering pages and numbering consecutively in the lower right-hand corner. It doesn't matter which orientation you use for your documentation. However, as in this example, you can see that the number of pages are not consecutively ordered correctly. We have 1, 2, and then 4. So you would want to make sure that your pages are ordered and numbered consecutively in the bottom right corner as shown in this example. Another tip for facilitating the documentation review process includes using the item number that's listed in the handbook section for documentation and marking the location on the documentation page that is submitted. For example, we would look for 1.1, what is requested of 1.1, and then you would mark it on the actual documentation that is submitted as 1.1. As referenced before, each documentation requested item number should be marked on the appropriate page of the documentation file being submitted for review. For example, in this documentation file, the LEA submitted 4 pages. On their first page, they have documentation referencing item 1.1 and documentation referencing item 1.2. So the LEA would want to make sure that they mark where 1.1 documentation is and where 1.2 documentation is. On page 4, there's information related to item 1.4, and the LEA has indicated it on page 4. Another tip for facilitating documentation review process includes not including unnecessary pages. The LEA should use caution when determining what to submit to TEA for review. The LEA should only include relevant pages of the documents that have been requested. Please note that all documentation that ends up being submitted by the LEA must be reviewed in its entirety. And should the review determine unanticipated areas of noncompliance under additional documentation that was submitted, the LEA will be referred to the appropriate division for further review. The LEA should keep in mind that there are some documentation file size limitations. Each PDF file has a limit of 30 megabytes. You would want to make sure that you optimize your PDF file to reduce the size. Ensure that only pages that are actually needed are included in the documentation file. And for last resort, if you have one file that is too large, you can split the file and upload multiple PDF files as per the instructions that are going to be following in the next couple of slides. Now that we have completed step 1 of preparing documents for upload, which was gathering and assembling the documentation into one PDF file, we will now take a look at how to log into the FPC Work App system to complete the details form and upload the documentation PDF formatted file. We will now take a look at the instructions for submitting the documentation that is being requested. All documentation requested will be submitted via the FPC Smartsheet Work App. LEA staff submitting documentation will need access to the Department of Grant Compliance and Administration Work App system. Currently, the Superintendent, Chief Financial Officer, and Federal Programs Director listed in Ask TED have been given access to the system. To add or change the individuals with access to the system, please email us at isasupport@tea.texas.gov for instructions on how to get that completed. Please note that each LEA is only guaranteed a certain number of access accounts at this time. To begin the documentation submission process, the person with access will want to log into the Department of Grant Compliance and Administration Smartsheets Work App system. The login page is shown on the right of the screen, where the person with access will need to enter their email address and the password to gain access to the Federal Program Compliance Division Random Validation Work App. Once you have logged into the Department of Grant Compliance and Administration Work App system, you will now click on the Federal Program Compliance Division Work App tile as shown on the right. If you are not able to locate the Federal Program Compliance Division Work App tile, you may want to try clicking on the menu icon that's in the shape of a diamond on the left-hand side of your screen to display all the Work App tiles that you have access to. After you have clicked on the Federal Program Compliance Division Work App tile, you will be given access to the Federal Program Compliance Division Work App. Once you're in the Work App, you're going to want to click on the Program Monitoring Random Validation link as shown on the right. Please note that the screen captures referenced in the next slides will show information that is specific to a Title I Part A program requirement. When you log into the system, the information referenced will include the information that is specific to the program and the requirement that your LEA was selected to submit documentation for. After you are in the Program Monitoring Random Validation Federal Program Compliance Division Work App, you'll be able to locate the line for the initial submission that includes your LEA name and CDN number, the stage of the random validation process, the program that you were selected to participate in, and the specific requirement. In this example, ABC ISD was selected for Title I, Part A, School-Wide Program Campus Comprehensive Needs Assessment Process. The LEA should make sure that they click on the Initial Submission line to access the Details Form and Data and Attachments tabs. Throughout the documentation review process, if the program manager decides that additional documentation is needed or that there are some clarifying questions that need to be asked prior to the final review of the documentation, the program manager may reach out to the LEA for additional submission. That is the only time that the additional submission line will be accessed. For initial submission, the LEA should click on the Initial Submission line to access the Details Form and Data and Attachments tab. Once you've clicked on the Initial Submission line, you will now be able to access and complete the Details Form Data tab. On the Details form, the first thing you're going to see is the LEA name and CDN number, the program, and the requirement that the LEA was selected for to participate in the random validation process. In this example, the LEA was selected to participate in the Title I Part A program, Campus Written Parent and Family Engagement Policy. Below that is a section for the requested documentation. In this case, you can see up to 2 requested documentation pieces. In the requested documentation 1 page numbers, that's where you'll list the page numbers of the documentation file that is going to be submitted that correspond with the first requested documentation. So for example, if documentation for requested documentation 1 is found on pages 1 and 3, you would note 1 and 3 under the requested documentation 1 page numbers. If your requested documentation 2 is found on page 2, then you would note page 2 under requested documentation 2. Please note that you will also need to scroll down to be able to access the additional information that's on the Details Form Data tab. Once you've entered the requested documentation page numbers and scrolled down, you will now have access to the rest of the form. The rest of the form includes the LEA Program Contact Information section. In this section, you'll complete the remaining fields with the information for the LEA Program Contact. That should be the person that is most familiar with the documentation that was submitted. This is a person that TEA will contact if additional documentation is needed and/or if clarification is needed on the documentation that was submitted. In this section, you should include the LEA program contact name, their email address, and their phone number. Under the LEA program contact information section that is required is the LEA comment field. This LEA comment field is not required. However, if an LEA would like to share additional information related to the documentation that has been submitted, they can include it in this section so that the reviewer can have that context for the submission documentation that was submitted. The final field on this form is the LEA submission status field. On the LEA submission status, there's 2 options, in process and submission complete. In process means that you have not uploaded the attachments or the documentation needed to complete the submission process. Submission complete means that you've completed the Details Form Data tab. And you've also gone to the next tab, which is Attachments, which we'll discuss later on in this presentation. And you've uploaded the documentation and you now are ready for TEA to review your documentation. Please note that you must have a submission complete by the due date. If you are still in process, TEA will contact you to get your documentation submitted and uploaded in a timely manner so that the review can commence. The next step in the process is to save the information that was entered into the Details Form Data tab. At the bottom of the screen, you'll see a Save message. You'll note that if the Save button is grayed out and inaccessible, a required field is missing information. So as you can see here, the LEA has not filled in the program contact name, email address, or phone number, and therefore the Save button at the bottom of the screen is grayed out. Once the LEA completes that information and enters it, the Save button will be blue, which means that now the information can be saved. To save the information, you'd click on the Save button and the information will be saved. The next step in the process is uploading your documentation. First, click on the Attachments tab in the Details data form. Then the Attach a File window will open. Click on Attach a File. Then the computer browser screen will open and you can browse through your computer files and locate the documentation file. You would want to verify that the file name is the actual file that you want to attach to the WorkApp system. Once you click on Open, the file will automatically be attached in the WorkApp system. You will want to verify that the correct document is attached. You can then click on the X in the top right-hand corner to close the Details form. Now that you've attached your document and entered all the information in the Details Form Data tab, you're now ready to sign out of the WorkApp system. To sign out, you're going to want to locate the icon with the person, click on Sign Out, and you'll be able to sign out of the system successfully. This concludes the Documentation Submission Instructions and Requirements training portion of the Program Monitoring Random Validations process. If you have any additional questions, please email your questions to essasupport@tea.texas.gov. Thank you. We will now take a look at the resources that are available to assist you in the Program Monitoring Random Validations process. All random validation resources can be found on the Federal Program Compliance Division webpage under the Related Content area and the link referenced as ESSA Random Validation Monitoring. The Phase 1 resources will be posted by October 2nd, and the Phase 2 resources will be posted by November 27th. The resources will be organized on the web page by the particular phase of the random validation process. Here you can see the Phase 1 documents and resources. There will be a General Resources section. Under that General Resources section, there will be the Phase 1 timeline, a process overview, documents overview, documentation submission requirements overview, and the random validation Phase 1 complete presentation that includes all of the presentations noted here. For the Phase 1 timeline, if you click on the link, it will open up the Phase 1 timeline. For all the others, if you click on the training slides for that particular overview, you will be able to download the training slides. You will also be able to access a training video for each section of the training. Again, at the very bottom, you'll be able to see the complete presentation that is a composite training of the training slides and training video of the process overview, the documents overview, and the documentation submission requirements, all in one presentation. For the program-specific resources, LEAs would want to note that LEAs were selected to provide documentation for only one of the requirements noted. If your LEA has been selected to participate in the 23-24 program monitoring process, please be sure to access the resources for the program and corresponding program requirement that your LEA was selected to submit documentation for. Documenting overall compliance for a program requirement may require several forms of documentation to be maintained locally and available upon request by TEA and/or an auditor. To ensure overall compliance with program requirements, LEAs should refer to the program guide and/or other program-related resources that reference the multiple forms of documentation required to be maintained locally. The documentation requested for submission during the random validation process may not include all forms of documentation that are required to be maintained locally. Here is an example of the program-specific resources that were made available in the last year. For the Title I Part A program, if we look specifically at the supplement not supplant methodology, for every requirement and every program, there will be a handbook that's available, training slides, and a training video that accompany the training slides. This concludes a portion of the training related to the resources. If you have any questions or you'd like to reach out to the Federal Program Compliance Division, please email your questions to essasupport@tea.texas.gov. So now we will go over some key dates for Phase 1 of the random validation process. TEA will post the final random validation documents and voiced over PowerPoint videos to the ESSA Random Validation Monitoring webpage by October 2nd. By October 9th or on October 9th, LEAs will receive email notification of selection, and TEA will also post the lists of the LEAs that have been selected. October 10th through the 23rd, the Education Service Centers will offer and provide technical assistance to the LEAs that have been selected, and LEAs are required to upload their documentation by October 23rd. Key dates for Phase 2 of the random validation process are as follows. TEA will post final random validation documents and voiced over PowerPoint videos to the ESSA Random Validation Monitoring webpage by November 27th. LEAs will receive email notification of their selection on November 28th, and TEA will also post the list of the LEAs that have been selected for Phase 2. Between November 29th and December 12th, ESCs will offer and provide technical assistance to the LEAs selected, and documentation is required to be submitted by December 12th by the LEAs. This concludes the training for the 2023-2024 Program Monitoring Random Validations process administered by the Federal Program Compliance Division. If you have any questions or you'd like to reach out to us for additional information, please contact us at our division phone number at 512-463-9499 or via email at essasupport@tea.texas.gov. Thank you.